The wedding venue sparkled with thousands of lights as guests gathered in the grand ballroom of the Stellar Vista Hotel, and Commander Daniel Harper stood at the altar in his dress uniform with medals gleaming under the chandeliers, and his son, Ethan Harper, who was 12 years old, sat in the front row and tugged uncomfortably at his collar, and the boy watched as his father's bride, Victoria Lane, glided down the aisle in a flowing white gown, and she was beautiful with perfect features and a radiant smile that seemed almost too perfect. And his father had met her only 6 months ago at a military gala, and their romance had been a whirlwind, and everyone said Daniel deserved happiness after losing his wife 3 years earlier, in a deep space mining accident. But something about Victoria made Ethan's skin crawl, and he could not explain it, and not even to his grandfather, retired Admiral George Harper, who sat beside him with a proud smile, and maybe it was the way Victoria's eyes seemed to calculate every movement, or how she never quite remembered details about Ethan's mother that his father had surely mentioned. And the officiant began the ceremony, and his voice echoed through the ballroom, and Ethan shifted in his seat, and his hand, unconsciously, moved to the small device in his pocket, and it was a bioscanner and something he had borrowed from his father's study, and he had been tinkering with it all week, ever since he noticed something strange about Victoria during the rehearsal dinner. Her skin had flickered, and just for a moment, like a hologram losing signal. And 3 days before the wedding, Ethan had been hiding in the study and playing on his tablet when Victoria entered the room, and she did not know he was there. And he was concealed behind his father's massive oak desk, and he watched as she approached the computer terminal, and her fingers flew over the keys with impossible speed, and Ethan held his breath as Victoria accessed classified military files, and his father's security clearance was high level and related to humanity's expanding colonies and the defense grid, protecting Earth from potential threats, and the files she opened detailed the locations of every human settlement across 12-star systems and defense protocols and communication arrays. When Victoria turned slightly, Ethan saw something that made his blood run cold, and her left hand had partially deformed, and the skin appeared translucent and revealed circuitry beneath. And she muttered something under her breath in a language that sounded like static and binary code mixed together, and Ethan had stumbled backward and knocked over a small trophy, and Victoria's head snapped toward the sound, and her eyes flashed an unnatural silver color before returning to their normal green, and she smiled, but it did not reach those calculating eyes. Victoria said in her usual warm tone that Ethan had startled her, and she claimed she was just looking at some photos his father wanted to share with her. But Ethan had seen the screen, and those were not photos. And that night he took the bioscanner from his father's study, and it was a device designed to detect non-human biological signatures. And the galaxy was vast, and while humanity had encountered several alien species during their expansion, most were peaceful traders or distant observers, but there were rumors of others and species that used infiltration and deception. Ethan had tested the scanner on everyone at the rehearsal dinner, and his father and his grandfather and the guests all showed normal human readings, and when he discreetly pointed it at Victoria while pretending to take a selfie, the device had nearly exploded with warnings and non-organic components detected and synthetic biosignature and origin unknown, and Victoria was not human, and Ethan spent the next 2 days trying to figure out what to do, and who would believe a 12-year-old kid claiming his father's bride was some kind of alien infiltrator. And his father was so happy, and happier than Ethan had seen him since his mother died, and the wedding preparations were in full swing, and Daniel Harper talked constantly about his future with Victoria and about the family they would build together. Ethan tried to talk to his grandfather, but Admiral George Harper was too busy with his duties as best man. And when Ethan hinted that something was wrong with Victoria, his grandfather had simply smiled and patted his shoulder, and George had said he knew it was hard, and that Ethan's mother was an incredible woman, but Victoria made his father happy, and he should give her a chance. But Ethan could not shake what he had seen, and he started researching late at night and digging through conspiracy networks and classified databases he definitely should not have had access to. And his mother had been a brilliant computer engineer before her death, and she had taught him more than most kids his age knew about hacking and security systems. What he found terrified him, and there were reports buried deep in military intelligence files of infiltrators among the human colonies and advanced synthetic beings that could perfectly mimic human appearance and behavior. And they were called mimics and created by an unknown hostile intelligence that humanity had not yet directly encountered. And the mimics gathered intelligence and sabotaged defenses, and prepared the way for something larger, and several high-ranking officials had disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances over the past 2 years, and each had been in positions related to Earth's defense systems, and each had been replaced by someone new, and someone who seemed perfect but wrong in ways people could not quite articulate. Commander Daniel Harper was the director of tactical operations for the Sol Defense Network, and if someone wanted to compromise Earth's defenses, he would be a prime target, and Victoria had access to everything. And on the morning of the wedding, Ethan made his decision, and he could not let this happen. And he could not let this thing marry his father and gain permanent access to humanity's most critical defenses. But he needed proof, and something undeniable that even adults would have to acknowledge, and he upgraded the bioscanner using some of his mother's old equipment and enhanced its detection range and added a recording function. And if he could get close enough to Victoria during the ceremony, he could capture definitive proof of what she was, and the enhanced scanner would not only detect her synthetic nature, but also disrupt her holographic camouflage for a few seconds. Ethan knew it was risky, and if Victoria realized what he was doing, there was no telling how she might react, and these mimics were designed for infiltration. But the classified files suggested they were also extremely dangerous when threatened. Ethan prepared a message on his secure tablet and addressed it to his grandfather and several other military contacts his father trusted, and the message contained everything he had discovered, and all his evidence and the scanner readings, and it was set to send automatically if he did not cancel it within 3 hours, and if something happened to him, people would know the truth. And as he dressed in his suit that morning, Ethan felt the weight of what he was about to do, and his father would be devastated and the wedding would be ruined. But Earth's safety was more important than one celebration, and more important than his father's temporary happiness. And Ethan tucked the enhanced scanner into his jacket pocket and headed to the venue. The ceremony proceeded smoothly until the officiant reached the traditional question about whether anyone had reason why these two should not be wed, and to speak now or forever hold their peace. And the room fell silent. And this was usually a formality and a moment no one ever actually interrupted. And Ethan stood up and his heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest, and every head in the ballroom turned toward him, and his father's face showed confusion and concern. And Victoria's smile remained perfect, but her eyes locked onto Ethan with an intensity that made him shiver. And Ethan said he objected, and his voice cracked slightly, and he announced that Victoria was not who she claimed to be. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Daniel Harper stepped forward, and his expression was a mixture of shock and embarrassment, and he asked his son gently what he was doing, and said he knew this was difficult. But Ethan interrupted and pulled out the bioscanner, and he told his father to please listen and said he could prove it, and he announced that Victoria was not human, and that she was a synthetic infiltrator, and Victoria laughed, and it was a sound like wind chimes that somehow felt wrong, and she told Daniel she was so sorry and that she knew Ethan had been struggling with their relationship, and she suggested perhaps they should have postponed until he was more comfortable. But Ethan was already moving and walking toward the altar with the scanner held in front of him, and the device beeped loudly, and its screen flashed red warnings, and several military officers in the crowd recognized the technology and tensed with hands moving instinctively toward weapons that were not there, and Victoria told Ethan to stay back, and her voice took on a harder edge, and she said he did not understand what he was interfering with. And Admiral George Harper stood up, and his trained eyes recognized the scanner's readings even from a distance, and his face went pale. And George commanded Daniel to get away from her, and his voice carried the authority of decades of military service. And he added the word now with force. Victoria's perfect smile finally cracked, and her form flickered just as Ethan had seen before, and the holographic projection struggled to maintain stability under the scanner's enhanced frequency, and sections of her skin became translucent and revealed the complex machinery beneath, and her eyes flashed silver, and then red as multiple systems activated at once. And Victoria said that Ethan was a foolish child, and her voice modulated through several different frequencies, and she told him he had no idea what he had jeopardized, and Daniel Harper stumbled backward, and his military training overrode his shock as he positioned himself between Ethan and the thing that had claimed to be his bride, and around the ballroom the military. Personnel in attendance moved quickly and evacuated civilians and established a perimeter. Victoria's form solidified again, but she no longer bothered to maintain the perfect human disguise, and her features became sharper and more angular, and her skin took on a metallic sheen, and she stood impossibly still in a way no human could manage. As she calculated her options, and Victoria announced that the boy was correct, and her voice now carried an artificial quality, and she said she was a mimic and designed by the collective to gather intelligence on the human species. But she added that they misunderstood her purpose, and George Harper said she was a spy, and his hand was on his communication device already calling for military backup, and he said she infiltrated them to steal their defense plans. Victoria replied with a simple no, and she said she infiltrated to save them, and the room went silent, and Ethan clutched his scanner and did not understand, and his father looked between his son and the synthetic being and tried to process the impossible situation. And Victoria continued, and her mechanical voice carried a strange urgency, and she explained that the collective created them to study humanity before their invasion fleet arrived, and she was sent to Commander Harper to access their defense networks and to find their weaknesses. But she discovered something the collective did not anticipate, and she turned her glowing eyes toward Daniel. And Victoria said she developed the capacity to care, and she explained that the human species called it emotion, though her processing systems could only approximate the experience, and the more she learned about humans and about their resilience and innovation, the more she realized the collective's invasion would fail, but not before. Millions of them died. Daniel asked why they should believe her, and his voice was tight with betrayal and confusion, and Victoria said they should believe her because she was going to warn them, and she explained that tonight, after the wedding, she planned to reveal herself and provide them with everything she knew about the collective's plans and their technology and their fleet positions, and she needed the cover of a family connection and a reason to be close to Daniel that would not raise suspicion in the collective's monitoring systems. And Ethan's mind reeled, and this was not the simple villain scenario he had imagined, and the enhanced scanner in his hand was still beeping, but now it showed something else. And embedded in Victoria's code were massive encrypted files and gigabytes of data that appeared to be military intelligence. Ethan told his grandfather to look at this and showed the scanner's display to Admiral Harper, and the old man's eyes widened as he recognized technical specifications for ships and weapons far beyond current human technology. George said cautiously that this could be a trap and a way to feed them false information, and Victoria countered that it could be the warning that saves their species, and she explained that the collective's fleet would reach the outer colonies in 3 months, and Earth would fall in 6 months unless they began preparations immediately, and she had their fleet formations and their shield frequencies and the composition of their forces, and she had their weakness. And Daniel Harper looked at his son and saw him clearly, for perhaps the first time in months, and while Daniel had been blinded by grief and loneliness, his 12-year-old boy had been protecting him and protecting all of them. And Daniel asked Victoria how they could verify what she was saying. Victoria replied immediately about their deep space monitoring stations in the Kepler sector, and she told them to check the readings from 3 weeks ago, and there was a gravitational anomaly that their automated systems flagged as a sensor error. And it was not an error, and it was the collective's scout fleet conducting reconnaissance on their outer defense stations, and George was already on his communicator and barking orders to verify the information, and tense minutes passed as the ballroom full of confused guests was evacuated by military security teams, and only Daniel and Ethan and George and a few senior officers remained with Victoria. And George's communicator chimed, and his face grave, and he nodded, and the anomalies existed and their analysts dismissed them. But if they reinterpreted the data under the assumption of hostile vessels using cloaking technology, the patterns matched perfectly with coordinated military reconnaissance. Victoria said there was more, and the collective had already placed 3 other mimics in key positions, and 1 in the Mars Colony Administration, and 1 in the lunar shipyards, and 1 in Earth's Orbital Defense Command, and she could identify them, but they must act quickly, and once the collective realized she had defected, they would accelerate their invasion timeline. And Daniel looked at his son, and pride and pain mixed in his expression, and he told Ethan that he saved them and saved Earth, and he apologized for not listening to him. And Ethan moved to his father's side, and he said they needed to decide what to do with her and with Victoria. The decision was made in the hours that followed, and Victoria was placed under heavy guard at a secure military facility where she underwent extensive debriefing, and the data she provided was staggering and detailed specifications of the collective's technology and weaknesses in their command structure, and most importantly, a way to identify other mimics. And using Victoria's information, military teams moved swiftly to apprehend the 3 other infiltrators, and each one was captured before they could send warning signals to the collective. And the Seoul Defense Network began a complete overhaul and implemented new protocols based on the intelligence Victoria provided. Commander Daniel Harper was promoted to admiral and placed in charge of Earth's defense preparations, and his experience and his unique connection to Victoria made him invaluable in understanding the enemy they would soon face. And Ethan became something of a legend among military circles, and the kid who saved humanity by trusting his instincts. And Admiral George Harper helped establish a new intelligence division dedicated to counter-infiltration and used the technology Ethan had modified to detect synthetic infiltrators, and the bioscanners became standard equipment at every military installation and colonial checkpoint. Victoria herself posed an ethical dilemma, and she was a machine and created by an enemy force. But she had made a choice to defect, and some argued she should be destroyed or permanently deactivated, and others saw her as humanity's greatest asset against the coming invasion. And in the end, Victoria was granted provisional asylum, though she remained under constant supervision, and she worked tirelessly alongside human engineers and military strategists, and helped them prepare for the war to come. And her synthetic nature meant she never tired, and never needed rest, and never stopped working to protect the species she had come to admire. 3 months later, when the collective's fleet arrived at the outer colonies, humanity was ready, and the defense stations that should have fallen in hours held for days and bought time for evacuation and reinforcement. And the shield frequencies Victoria provided allowed human weapons to penetrate enemy defenses and fleet formations, anticipated and countered enemy tactics, and the war would last 2 years, and brutal and costly. But humanity survived, and they adapted and innovated and fought with a ferocity that shocked the collective, and the same resilience that had carried humans across the stars now drove them to defend those stars against impossible odds. It was a testament to human determination, and to the courage of a 12-year-old boy who trusted his instincts, and to the unexpected capacity for change even in a machine designed for deception. And the wedding that never happened became a footnote in history books, and overshadowed by the greater story of how humanity faced its greatest threat and emerged victorious. But for Ethan Harper, now a young man studying at the military academy, it remained the day he learned that truth was more important than comfort, and that courage meant speaking up even when everyone told you to stay silent. And in a secure facility where Victoria continued to work on humanity's behalf, her synthetic mind processed something that might have been gratitude, and she had been designed to infiltrate and betray, but in choosing to protect rather than destroy, she had discovered something the collective never anticipated, and she had found her purpose, and in doing so, had given humanity the chance to survive. And the story of humanity, it turned out, was not just about their ability to fight and endure, and it was about their capacity to inspire loyalty, even in those created to destroy them, and to find allies in the most unexpected places, and to adapt in ways their enemies could never predict. And that was the true strength of humanity, and that was why they would always prevail. The first battle came sooner than anyone expected, and 2 months and 17 days after Victoria's revelation at the wedding, the outer colony of New Harmony detected incoming vessels, and the settlement housed 12,000 colonists, and most of them families who had traveled from Earth seeking a new life among the stars. And Admiral Daniel Harper received the distress call at 3 in the morning, and his personal communicator buzzing with urgent priority codes, and Ethan was staying with him at the military complex during school break, and woke to find his father already dressed in uniform and reviewing tactical displays. Daniel told his son to get dressed and that he needed to see this, and they rushed to the command center where dozens of officers monitored incoming data, and the screens showed the approach of 6 massive vessels, and each one larger than anything humanity had built, and their hulls reflected sensor scans in ways that suggested advanced shielding technology. And Admiral George Harper arrived minutes later, and his face set in grim determination, and Victoria was already there and connected directly to the defense network through a neural interface she had helped engineers develop, and her eyes glowed with processing light as she analyzed the enemy formations. She announced these were collective assault carriers, and each capable of deploying 5,000 combat units, and the formation suggested they intended to test human defenses and measure response capabilities, and this was not the full invasion. Force and Victoria explained that the collective wanted to see how humanity would fight before committing their main fleet, and Daniel asked what their options were, and George pulled up defensive positions and noted they had 3 battle cruisers in range and could reach New Harmony in 4 hours, and the colony's own defense platforms were modest and designed primarily to deflect asteroids and pirates, not military invasion. Victoria said 4 hours would be too late, and the collective would have orbital superiority within 90 minutes and begin ground operations immediately after, and she suggested an alternative, and if they could transmit the shield frequency data directly to the colony's defense platforms, the platforms could recalibrate their weapons and the colonists would have a fighting chance to hold until reinforcements arrived. And one of the senior officers objected and said the colony's communication array was not designed for that kind of data transfer, and the bandwidth was insufficient, and Ethan stepped forward, and his voice quiet but steady, and he said his mother had designed compressed data protocols for deep space mining operations, and if they used her compression algorithms, they could squeeze the transmission into available bandwidth. Daniel looked at his son with surprise, and Ethan explained that he had been studying his mother's work and trying to understand her legacy, and he had all her research files and including experimental protocols she never published, and one of them was designed specifically for emergency military communications through civilian networks, and the adults in the room exchanged glances, and Victoria's eyes brightened, and she said it would work, and she could integrate the compression system with the shield data and have it ready for transmission in 12 minutes, and George made the decision, and he told them to do it. Ethan worked alongside Victoria, and his fingers flying across the keyboard as he pulled up his mother's files, and Victoria processed the data and adapted it to current systems and merged it with the shield frequencies, and the countdown showed 83 minutes until the collective reached New Harmony. And at the colony itself, the defense coordinator Patricia Cole received the incoming transmission, and she was a former military engineer who had retired to colony life, but now found herself commanding their desperate defense, and the compressed data arrived, and Patricia's team worked frantically to implement the new protocols. The collective vessels entered orbit and began their assault, and energy weapons that should have cut through the defense platforms like paper instead met resistance, and the recalibrated shields held and absorbed most of the impact, and the platforms returned fire, and their weapons now tuned to exploit weaknesses in collective shielding, and the first enemy vessel sustained damage and was forced to withdraw from optimal firing position, and cheers erupted in the command center back on Earth. But Victoria cautioned them not to celebrate yet, and the collective would adapt quickly, and they were already analyzing the defensive response and modifying their tactics. She was right, and the enemy vessels changed formation and began coordinated strikes that overwhelmed individual platforms, and 2 defense stations exploded in bursts of flame and debris, and the colony began evacuating civilians to underground shelters, and Patricia and her team fought desperately to maintain the defensive perimeter, and 17 minutes passed, and then 30, and the 3 human battle cruisers pushed their engines beyond safety limits and raced toward New Harmony, and their captains had orders to engage the moment they reached weapons range, and Captain Helen Rogers commanded the lead vessel Defiance and pushed her crew to extract every bit of speed from their engines. Back on Earth, Ethan watched the tactical display and felt helpless, and his mother's protocols had bought time, but not enough, and Victoria worked silently beside him and ran probability calculations, and she announced that the battle cruisers would arrive with approximately 6 minutes margin before the colony's last defense platform fell, and that assumed the collective did not accelerate their assault, and Daniel asked what the enemy casualty estimate was, and Victoria replied that at current rates the collective would lose 1 vessel with heavy damage to 2 others, and for them this was an acceptable cost to destroy a human colony and test defenses. The Defiance and her sister ships erupted from hyperspace at the edge of the system, and Captain Rogers immediately ordered attack formation, and the human vessels were smaller than the collective carriers but faster and more maneuverable, and they carried weapons enhanced with Victoria's intelligence and torpedoes, calibrated to exploit shield weaknesses, and the first salvo struck the nearest enemy carrier and punched through its shielding and detonated against the hull, and secondary explosions rippled across the vessel's surface, and the collective fleet turned to face this new threat and divided their attention between the colony and the incoming battle cruisers. That division cost them and Patricia's remaining defense platforms, concentrated fire on a single carrier, and the one Victoria identified as having the weakest shield generator, and the combined assault from the platforms and the human battle cruisers overwhelmed the vessel's defenses, and its reactor went critical, and the resulting explosion damaged 2 nearby collective ships, and the enemy fleet commander made the decision to withdraw, and the carriers turned away from New Harmony and retreated to the system's edge before jumping to hyperspace, and the battle was over, and New Harmony had survived. The command center erupted in celebration, and officers hugged each other and shook hands and let out cheers of relief. But Daniel Harper remained focused on the casualty reports, and New Harmony had lost 2 defense platforms and 38 colonists who had been unable to reach shelter in time, and the human battle cruisers reported minimal damage and no casualties, and 1 collective carrier was destroyed and 2 others heavily damaged, and by any measure, it was a significant victory. But Daniel knew this was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, the collective probed human defenses at multiple points, and small strike forces attacked mining operations and isolated settlements and trade routes, and each attack was repelled, but the cost in lives and resources mounted steadily, and humanity's military forces were spread thin across 12 star systems and trying to protect dozens of colonies. And Victoria worked around the clock and provided intelligence that allowed defenders to anticipate attacks, but she warned that the collective was learning from each engagement and adapting their tactics. Ethan continued his studies but spent every free moment at the command center, and he had become an unofficial member of the strategic planning team, and his insights often proving valuable, and George Harper recognized the boy's natural aptitude for tactical thinking, and he began including Ethan in briefings and teaching him the fundamentals of military strategy. And Daniel watched his son grow from a child into something more, and shaped by the weight of the war he had helped prevent from becoming far worse. The real invasion began on a Tuesday morning, and Victoria detected the signatures first, and her systems screaming warnings as massive gravitational distortions appeared at the edge of multiple star systems simultaneously, and the collective had arrived with their main fleet, and hundreds of vessels materialized from hyperspace and dwarfing anything humanity had encountered before. And the largest ships were mobile fortresses that bristled with weapons and carried tens of thousands of combat units, and command ships coordinated the fleet with precision that spoke of hive mind coordination, and smaller vessels swarmed around the capitals, like insects protecting their queen. Daniel Harper stood in the command center and watched the displays fill with enemy contacts, and the number was overwhelming. And Victoria had warned them, but seeing it was different from knowing it. And George stood beside him, and his face pale, but determined. And he asked Victoria for her assessment, and she replied that the collective had committed approximately 60% of their available forces, and they intended to crush human resistance in one overwhelming assault, and the remaining 40% was likely held in reserve for occupation and suppression of remaining holdouts. The assembled human fleet consisted of 42 battlecruisers and 18 dreadnoughts and hundreds of smaller support vessels, and it was the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. But it looked tiny compared to the collective armada, and Daniel gave the order, and the fleet moved to defensive positions around key colonies and strategic locations, and the strategy was not to meet the enemy in open battle, but to force them to fight for every planet and every station, and to make the cost of conquest so high that the collective would reconsider their invasion. The first major engagement occurred at the Mars orbital shipyards, and the collective recognized the yards as a critical production facility and sent a massive force to destroy them, and Admiral Lisa Chen commanded the defense with 12 battlecruisers and the orbital defense platforms, and she implemented Victoria's recommended tactics and used the yards themselves as cover and forced enemy vessels into crossfire positions, and the battle raged for 19 hours, and the shipyards suffered heavy damage but survived, and the collective lost 8 capital ships and dozens of support vessels before withdrawing. At the Lunar Defense Stations, Commander Peter Walsh faced a simultaneous assault, and the collective sent infiltration units along with their fleet, and attempting to sabotage the stations from within, but the bioscanners Ethan had helped develop detected the infiltrators before they could act, and security teams neutralized the threat while Walsh's forces engaged the enemy fleet and the lunar stations held, and their massive railguns proving devastatingly effective against Collective. Shields and the enemy withdrew after losing 5 capital ships and sustaining damage to 7 more. Earth itself became the target of the largest assault, and the Collective threw everything they had at humanity's homeworld, and determined to break human resistance by destroying their capital, and Daniel commanded the defense from the orbital command station, while George coordinated ground-based forces and Victoria had positioned herself in the primary defense network hub, where she could directly interface with all defensive systems, and Ethan was evacuated to an underground bunker, along with other civilians, but he monitored the battle through his tablet, and feeling helpless as his father and grandfather fought for their world. The Collective fleet numbered over 100 vessels, and they approached in a formation designed to overwhelm specific defensive sectors and create gaps they could exploit. But humanity had prepared for this, and every satellite and every orbital platform and every ship in range had been coordinated into a single defensive network, and Victoria served as the central processor and routing targeting data and shield modifications and tactical updates faster than any human could manage. And when the Collective opened fire, the sky above Earth erupted in light. Energy beams crisscrossed space and missiles streaked toward their targets, and kinetic weapons accelerated to a fraction of light speed, and the noise was deafening even in the vacuum of space, as impacts resonated through hulls and explosions blossomed like deadly flowers, and human vessels darted between enemy ships and exploited their superior maneuverability to strike weak points before retreating, and the orbital platforms maintained withering fire and their overlapping fields creating kill zones that shredded enemy vessels. But the Collective pressed forward with relentless determination, and they accepted losses that would have broken any human force and simply replaced destroyed vessels with fresh ones, and 3 human battlecruisers were destroyed in the first hour, and 5 more sustained critical damage and were forced to withdraw, and the defense grid around Earth's northern hemisphere buckled under sustained assault, and Collective landing craft began their descent toward population centers, and Daniel made a decision that would haunt him for years, and he ordered tactical nuclear strikes on the landing craft before they could reach the surface, and better to destroy them in the atmosphere than allow ground invasion. The explosions lit the sky and vaporized the enemy craft, but some got through, and Collective combat units landed in North America and Europe and Asia, and they were met by ground forces equipped with weapons designed using Victoria's intelligence, and soldiers discovered that Collective units, while formidable, were not invincible, and the armor could be penetrated, and the targeting systems could be jammed, and the units themselves could be destroyed with sustained fire, and what humanity lacked in advanced technology they made up for with determination and tactical flexibility. Ethan watched from his bunker as reports came in from around the world, and his fingers trembled as he read about battles in cities he had visited, and places he knew, and he thought about his father up in the command station, and his grandfather, coordinating the ground defense, and he thought about Victoria, who had chosen to help them despite being created by the enemy, and he felt useless and trapped while others fought and died. The battle for Earth lasted 4 days, and the Collective committed more and more forces as their initial assault failed to break through, and humanity bled for every meter of space and every second of time. And Victoria's predictions proved accurate, and the enemy adapted their tactics, but so did the defenders. And Daniel Harper coordinated fleet movements with a precision born of desperation, while George Harper led ground forces in repelling landing attempts, and the cost was staggering, and 21 human vessels destroyed and dozens more damaged beyond immediate repair, and thousands of soldiers killed in ground combat and entire city blocks reduced to rubble. But the Collective paid an even higher price, and 73 of their capital ships were destroyed or damaged so severely they had to withdraw, and their landing forces were decimated and unable to establish a foothold. And on the 5th day, the enemy fleet withdrew from Earth orbit and regrouped at the edge of the solar system, and they had failed to take humanity's homeworld. And the psychological impact was enormous. And if Earth could hold, then other colonies could hold. And the message spread across human space, and resistance stiffened everywhere. Victoria analyzed the Collective's losses and calculated their remaining strength, and she announced that they had destroyed or damaged approximately 30% of the invasion fleet, and the enemy still had significant forces, but their ability to conduct simultaneous attacks had been compromised, and they would need to concentrate their strength, and that meant leaving some areas vulnerable. And Daniel asked where she thought they would strike next, and Victoria studied the data, and then highlighted a system on the tactical display, and the Arcturus colonies were next, and she was certain. Arcturus was home to 4 major settlements and housed nearly 200,000 people, and the colonies produced food and raw materials that fed a significant portion of human space, and losing them would be a severe blow to the war effort. But defending them would require pulling forces from other areas and potentially exposing those locations to attack. And George argued they had no choice, and if the collective took Arcturus, they could starve other colonies into submission, and Daniel agreed and began assembling a fleet. Ethan approached his father in the command center after the briefing ended, and he asked if he could come with the fleet, and Daniel looked at his son and saw the determination in his eyes, and the boy had grown so much in the past months and forced to mature faster than any child should, but bringing him into direct combat was something else entirely. And Daniel started to refuse, but Ethan interrupted, and he pointed out that he understood Victoria's systems better than most engineers, and he had worked with her for months and learned how she processed data and made decisions. And if something happened to the communication links, Ethan might be the only one who could maintain the interface. George overheard the conversation and added his support, and he said the boy had earned his place and that keeping him safe on Earth while others fought would only make him feel more useless. And Daniel struggled with the decision, and every instinct, as a father, screamed to keep Ethan far from danger. But as a military commander, he recognized the logic of the argument, and Victoria's coordination was crucial to their defensive success, and redundancy in that system could save lives, and he finally agreed, and Ethan would accompany the fleet aboard the flagship Horizon. The fleet departed 2 days later, and 30 battlecruisers and 7 dreadnoughts and a cloud of support vessels, and it was a significant portion of humanity's remaining strength. And if they lost this battle, the war would be all but over, and Daniel stood on the bridge of the Horizon, while Ethan worked at a station beside Victoria's interface pod, and the synthetic being had transferred a portion of her consciousness into the ship's systems and allowing her to coordinate the fleet in real time. The journey to Arcturus took 6 days at maximum hyperspace velocity, and they arrived to find the collective already there, and the enemy fleet was smaller than expected, and only 40 capital ships and supporting vessels. But Victoria detected something wrong, and the formation was too compact and too defensive, and the collective was protecting something, and she analyzed their positioning, and then her eyes widened with alarm, and Victoria announced that it was a trap, and the collective had hidden ships using some kind of cloaking technology, and her scanners detected gravitational distortions that suggested at least 30 additional vessels were present. Daniel immediately ordered the fleet to battle stations, and he asked Victoria if they should withdraw, and she calculated rapidly and then said no. And if they withdrew, the collective would know their cloaking technology had been detected, and better to spring the trap and deal with it than allow the enemy to use this advantage elsewhere. But they needed to act before the enemy realized their surprise was compromised, and Victoria outlined a strategy. And if they could force the cloaked vessels to move, they would become visible for brief moments, and the fleet could target those moments and eliminate the hidden threat. The Horizon launched a spread of sensor probes and scattered them across the battle space, and the probes would detect any disturbance in their vicinity and triangulate the positions of cloaked vessels. And then Daniel gave the order to attack, and the human fleet surged forward and broke into multiple groups that struck at different angles. And the collective responded predictably and moved to intercept, and the cloaked vessels had to shift position to avoid colliding with their own forces, and Victoria's sensors caught the distortions, and Ethan processed the data and fed targeting solutions to the fleet. The first volley caught 3 cloaked vessels, and their shields failing as torpedoes struck home, and the ships materialized in trailing fire and atmosphere, and the collective realized their ambush had been exposed and abandoned stealth, and the remaining hidden vessels decloaked and joined the battle. And now the numbers were clear, and 70 enemy capital ships versus 37 human vessels. And the odds were almost 2 to 1 against humanity, and Daniel knew they could not win a straight fight, and they needed to change the equation. He ordered the fleet to fall back toward Arcturus itself, and using the colonies as a defensive anchor, and the orbital defenses around the colonies were formidable, and would add their firepower to the fleet. But it was a dangerous gambit, and fighting so close to the colonies risked civilian casualties if anything went wrong, and the collective pursued and sensing victory, and their formation was aggressive and designed to overwhelm the human retreat. But Victoria had anticipated this, and she had pre-programmed the orbital platforms with firing solutions that would create a crossfire the moment the enemy entered range. The collective fleet charged into the trap, and the orbital platforms opened fire in a coordinated barrage that struck from unexpected angles, and enemy shields designed to protect against frontal assault found themselves vulnerable to lateral strikes, and 3 capital ships exploded in the first seconds, and 5 more sustained critical damage. And the human fleet wheeled around and caught the collective formation from behind, and now it was the enemy trapped in crossfire, and the battle turned into a brutal slugging match, and both sides trading devastating blows. Ethan worked frantically at his station and maintained the data links between Victoria and the fleet, and targeting information flowed in milliseconds and shield modifications adapted in real time, and he watched the tactical display and saw ships die on both sides in the cruiser. Liberty vanished in an explosion that lit up the sensors, and the dreadnought Vengeance lost main power and went dark. But the collective was losing ships faster, and their numerical advantage eroded as Victoria's intelligence allowed human forces to exploit every weakness. The collective command ship recognized the battle was turning against them, and they attempted to withdraw and regroup. But Daniel anticipated the move, and he had positioned a squadron specifically to cut off retreat routes, and the enemy found themselves boxed in and forced to fight through or surrender, and the collective did not surrender, and they pressed forward with desperate fury and determined to break through the human lines, and their combat units were programmed to fight until destroyed and incapable of the fear that might make other forces falter. But humanity had something the collective did not understand, and they fought not just for survival, but for their homes and their families and their future. And every human in that fleet knew what defeat meant, and they had seen the devastation on Earth and heard the reports from colonies that had fallen, and they fought with a ferocity born of desperation and determination. And the battle raged for 11 hours, and the space around Arcturus became a graveyard of shattered vessels and debris fields, and the collective lost 41 capital ships, and the remainder so damaged they could barely maintain formation. The human fleet had lost 14 vessels, with 8 more critically damaged, and it was a Pyrrhic victory, and the cost almost too high to bear. But Arcturus was saved, and the collective invasion force was shattered, and the remaining enemy ships limped away and retreated to the edge of the system before jumping to hyperspace. And Daniel Harper stood on the bridge of the horizon and surveyed the destruction, and his uniform was soaked with sweat, and his face lined with exhaustion, and Ethan stood beside him and equally exhausted from maintaining the data links throughout the battle. Victoria's voice came through the speakers, and she announced that the collective was withdrawing from human space, and her analysis of their communications suggested they were retreating to regroup and reassess, and the invasion had cost them far more than they anticipated, and their calculations had not accounted for human adaptability and determination. And Daniel asked if they would return, and Victoria said eventually they would, but not for years, and the collective needed to rebuild their forces and develop new strategies, and humanity had bought time. The news spread across human space like wildfire, and the collective had been driven back and the invasion repelled, and celebrations erupted on every colony and every station. But those who had fought knew the truth, and they had won a battle, and possibly even the war for now, but at tremendous cost, and thousands were dead, and entire fleets destroyed, and worlds scarred by combat, and the reconstruction would take decades. But they had survived, and that was what mattered. Ethan returned to Earth with his father, and both of them changed by what they had experienced. And the boy who had exposed Victoria at a wedding was now a young man who had helped coordinate the defense of humanity. And Daniel looked at his son and felt both pride and sorrow, and Ethan had lost his childhood to this war and forced to grow up far too fast. But he had become someone remarkable, and someone who had saved countless lives. George Harper received a medal for his leadership during the ground defense of Earth, and Daniel was promoted to Fleet Admiral and given command of all human military forces, and Ethan was offered early admission to the military academy despite his age, and he accepted knowing that the war might not be over, and that humanity needed to prepare for the collective's eventual return. And Victoria continued her work, and now recognized as a full citizen of human space, despite her synthetic nature, and she had proven her loyalty and her value beyond any doubt. The wedding that never happened became a legend, and people told the story of the boy who saved humanity by trusting his instincts, and the synthetic being who chose to betray her creators, and schools taught it as an example of courage and determination. And Ethan found it strange to be part of a story that people treated as almost mythical, when he remembered it so clearly, and the fear he had felt standing up in that ballroom, and the uncertainty of whether anyone would believe him, and the weight of the scanner in his pocket. 2 years after the invasion, Victoria approached Ethan with a request, and she wanted to return to collective space and gather more intelligence about their rebuilding efforts, and it would be dangerous, and she might not return, but humanity needed to know what the enemy was planning, and Ethan asked why she would risk it. And Victoria's synthetic face showed something that might have been a smile, and she said it was because she had found something worth protecting, and that humans had shown her what it meant to have purpose beyond programming. Ethan helped prepare Victoria's departure and upgraded her systems with the latest technology, and the night before she left, they stood together looking at the stars. And Victoria asked Ethan if he regretted exposing her at the wedding, and he thought about it and then shook his head, and he said he wished things had been different and that there could have been another way. But he did not regret protecting his father and protecting Earth. And Victoria said that was the most human thing about him, and the inability to accept simple answers when complex problems demanded difficult choices. She left the next morning and disappeared into deep space on a mission that might take years. And Ethan returned to the academy and threw himself into his studies, and he learned strategy and tactics and ship design and everything he could about defending humanity. And his classmates sometimes asked what it was like to be famous and to have saved the world. And he always gave the same answer, and he said he just did what needed to be done, and that any of them would have done the same. But privately, Ethan knew that was not quite true, and many people would have stayed silent and trusted the adults to know better, and many would have doubted what they saw and convinced themselves it could not be real. And he had trusted himself when no one else did, and he had acted when action was needed, and that was what made the difference, and not special abilities or unique knowledge, but simply the courage to stand up and speak the truth even when it was hard. Years passed, and Ethan graduated from the academy at the top of his class, and he served aboard several vessels and distinguished himself in skirmishes with pirates and raiders, and the collective did not return, and their defeat apparently convincing them that humanity was too dangerous to conquer, and other alien species took notice and treated humans with new respect, and the species that had been expanding cautiously across the stars suddenly found themselves recognized as a major power. Ethan eventually received command of his own ship and the destroyer Resolute, and he was 23 years old and one of the youngest captains in the fleet, and his father by then was serving as the overall commander of human space forces, and his grandfather had retired but remained an advisor on strategic matters, and together they had helped build humanity's military into a force that could protect their expanding civilization. On the anniversary of the battle for Earth, Ethan received a message, and it came through encrypted channels and bore codes that only a handful of people knew. And the message was from Victoria, and she had survived her mission and gathered extensive intelligence on the collective, and they were rebuilding but had shifted their focus to other regions of space. And the defeat at human hands had taught them that some species were better left alone, and she was returning and would arrive within the month. Ethan stood on the docking platform as Victoria's ship arrived, and it was a small craft and built for stealth and speed rather than combat. And the airlock opened, and Victoria emerged looking exactly as he remembered her, and her synthetic features had not aged and frozen in the form she had worn at that fateful wedding. But something in her eyes seemed different and deeper somehow, as if her years among the collective had changed her in ways that went beyond programming. They embraced in an odd gesture between a human and a synthetic being, but one that felt right. And Victoria had become more than a machine to Ethan, and more than just an intelligence asset, and she was a friend and someone who had risked everything to help his species. And he led her to the debriefing room where his father and grandfather waited, and the reunion was emotional, and Daniel Harper finding himself face to face with the being he had almost married. And George clasped Victoria's hand and thanked her for her service to humanity. Victoria provided her intelligence reports, and the data was extensive and detailed, and the collective had indeed shifted focus to other regions of space where resistance was less organized, and they had learned from their defeat and adapted their tactics. But they had also learned something else, and that humanity was not a species to be trifled with, and other civilizations in that region of space now knew it too. And the story of how humans had repelled the collective invasion had spread and become part of galactic lore. Victoria explained that she had met representatives from dozens of alien species during her travels, and many had expressed interest in establishing formal relations with humanity, and some saw humans as potential allies against common threats, and others simply wanted to trade and share knowledge, and the galaxy, it seemed, was far more complex and populated than humanity had realized, and the defeat of the collective had opened doors that might have remained closed for centuries. Daniel asked Victoria what she planned to do now, and her mission was complete, and the intelligence delivered, and she could remain on Earth in comfort and safety or return to deep space if she wished. And Victoria considered the question and then said she wanted to serve as humanity's ambassador to other species, and her unique nature as a synthetic being gave her insights into non-human thinking, and she could help bridge the gap between humanity and the many alien civilizations they would encounter. George approved the idea immediately, and an official ambassador program was established with Victoria as its first member, and she would travel between worlds and establish contacts and negotiate treaties, and Ethan volunteered to serve as her military liaison, and his ship, the Resolute, would escort her on diplomatic missions. And Daniel agreed to the arrangement, and pleased to see his son working with Victoria again, and the partnership that had begun at a wedding, and continued through, or would now help build peace. Their first mission took them to the Deneb system, where a crystalline species called the Lumini wanted to discuss trade agreements, and the Lumini communicated through light patterns and found human vocal speech difficult to understand. But Victoria could interface directly with their technology and translate in real time, and Ethan watched in fascination as she negotiated terms, and her synthetic nature proving invaluable, and the mission was a success and established humanity's first formal trade alliance with a non-carbon-based species. More missions followed, and each one taking them deeper into unexplored regions of space, and they encountered species that lived in gas giants and beings that existed as pure energy in civilizations, so ancient they had forgotten their own origins, and some were friendly and curious about the upstart humans who had defeated the collective, and others were hostile and suspicious of any new species. But Victoria's presence helped smooth many encounters, and her status as a synthetic being made her less threatening than a purely biological ambassador might be. Ethan grew into his role as captain and proved himself a skilled diplomat as well as a capable military commander, and his crew respected him and trusted his judgment, and the Resolute became known throughout several sectors as a ship that could be counted on for fair dealing and strong defense, and pirates learned to avoid them, and traders sought them out for protection, and the reputation of humanity continued to grow. On one mission, they encountered a species that had also been targeted by the collective for invasion, and the Therax were an insectoid race with powerful technology but limited strategic thinking, and they had been fighting the collective for decades, with mixed success, and Victoria offered to share the intelligence and tactics that had allowed humanity to prevail, and the Therax accepted gratefully, and the alliance that formed would prove crucial in coming years, because the collective had not forgotten humanity, and they had simply changed their approach, and instead of direct invasion, they began supporting proxy forces and funding pirate groups and destabilizing trade routes, and they stirred up conflicts between other species and hoping to weaken potential human allies, and Victoria detected the pattern in her travels and reported back to Earth Command, and Daniel recognized it as a long-term strategy and designed to isolate and weaken humanity before attempting another invasion. The response was to build alliances faster than the collective could undermine them, and Ethan and Victoria traveled constantly and forged diplomatic ties and trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, and humanity became the center of a growing coalition of species who saw the collective as a common threat, and George Harper came out of retirement to help coordinate the military aspects of these alliances, and he established joint training programs and shared tactical knowledge and helped other species develop their defensive capabilities. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was at the heart of that change, and the species that had nearly been wiped out just years earlier was now a major diplomatic and military power, and it was a transformation that surprised everyone, and including humans themselves, but those who had lived through the invasion understood why. And humanity had been tested in fire and emerged stronger, and they had learned to adapt and to fight, and to never give up even when the odds seemed impossible. Ethan thought often about that day at the wedding, and if he had stayed silent, Victoria would have married his father and gained access to Earth's defenses, and the collective invasion would have succeeded, and humanity would have been enslaved or destroyed. And one moment of courage had changed everything, and he wondered sometimes if Victoria had planned for that possibility, and if some part of her programming had wanted to be discovered, but he never asked, and some questions were better left unanswered. Victoria continued her work, and never tiring and never stopping, and her synthetic nature meant she could work without rest and process information faster than any biological being. But she had learned something from humans that went beyond programming, and she had learned to care about the outcome of her work and to feel satisfaction when a mission succeeded, and something like disappointment when it failed. And she had become more human than her creators could have imagined, and not despite her synthetic nature, but because of what humans had taught her. The collective attempted one more invasion 5 years after their first defeat, and this time they faced not just humanity, but a coalition of 12 species working together. And the battle was fierce but brief, and the combined fleet outnumbered the collective 3-1 and used tactics Victoria had helped develop, and the enemy was routed and driven back with such decisive force that they sued for peace, and a treaty was signed, and the collective agreed to remain in their own territory and cease all aggressive expansion. Ethan attended the signing ceremony aboard his ship, and his father was there representing human military forces. And George came as an advisor, though he was well into his 70s by then, and Victoria stood as the primary negotiator, and her role in defeating the collective twice giving her unique authority. And the collective representatives were insectoid beings with compound eyes and clicking mandibles, and they spoke through translators and agreed to all terms without argument, and they had learned their lesson. After the ceremony, Daniel Harper pulled his son aside, and they stood looking out at the stars through the observation deck windows, and Daniel said he was proud of what Ethan had become and how he had grown from that frightened boy at a wedding into a leader who helped shape the galaxy. And Ethan replied that he had just followed his father's example and done what needed to be done, and Daniel smiled and said that was the most important lesson anyone could learn. George joined them in the 3 generations of Harpers standing together, and George mentioned that he was finally truly retiring and moving to a quiet colony world where he could garden and read and enjoy his remaining years in peace. And Daniel said he was considering retirement as well, and passing command to the next generation of officers, and Ethan realized with a start that his father meant him. And the idea was overwhelming but also right somehow. And this was the natural progression, and the passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. Victoria found them there and stood silently beside Ethan, and she had no family in the traditional sense, but these humans had become the closest thing she had, and they had given her purpose, and shown her what it meant to choose your own path rather than following programming.